Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on this Thursday edition of the podcast. And with all three of us back now, we are going to dive into some post-spring football analysis, breakdown, what we want to call it. I don't know, but it's an analysis. On duckterritory.com, you want to head over there. You can find the story. Jared did the defense, and that's where we're going to talk first. Erik did the offense, two deeps. This podcast will be strictly on the defensive side of the football. We'll run through the position groups here, and then Jared will give his explanations of maybe one or two guys or the whole group, depending on the position. And then Erik and I will react to it. So, Jared, first of all, before we dive too deep into each position group, just looking at this exercise post-spring to going into spring, you did both. Were there any kind of surprises in your eyes, overarching surprises with the entire two deep, after you saw all of spring football?
No, not really. I think there were just a couple guys where, they hit the transfer portal, or someone like Keith Brown, who was in my two deep originally going into spring, was not in it coming out of spring, obviously. But I think spring ball just kind of solidified what my two deep was. I went pretty conservative with the two deep at the time and just went with guys who I really thought were going to be on the two deep. Lo and behold, most of them were. I think only a handful of them weren't. Again, this projected two deep is what I think. It's not necessarily what we're going to see on the field next season. It's not necessarily full of people who we aren't going to see on the field next season. There is certainly some bias into some of my selections, but for the most part, during spring camp, we really didn't see anything in terms of an 11-on-11 experience. We only saw fastball once, and then the spring game. So there wasn't a whole lot to go on. And then the spring game was even more difficult because the two sides obviously were split up. So you don't really know what your number one defense. You kind of have to mix and match. The green team was playing a 4-2-5 with a nickel corner, nickel safety, whatever you want to play or whatever you want to say about that. So basically three cornerbacks in the field. The yellow team was playing Oregon's more traditional 4-2-5 with two corners and three safeties on the field. So there's some mixing and matching that you got to do. But overall, I don't know. I think it was pretty conservative in my spring guesses the first time around. I think this one is also conservative just because there's just not a whole lot of information to go on, and again, a couple bias picks, but nothing crazy, I would say.
All right, let's look at the defensive line group first. You want to roll through maybe just the guys that you listed off, and then highlight one or two guys that you feel like were difficult here?
Yeah, of course. So defensive end, I have Brandon Dorlus and Mace Funa. Nose tackle, I have Popo Hamavai or Taki Taimani. Defensive tackle, I have Casey Rogers or Keon Ware-Hudson. Edge, Jordan Birch or Mateo Uiagalelei. The positioning in this group is a little difficult just because of the position versatility that this defensive line has. A lot of these guys were lining up outside, inside, wherever you want to do it, except for Keon Ware-Hudson and Casey Rogers. People are like real interior guys who aren't going to be lining up at D end or edge. But Jordan Birch and Brandon Dorlus have the ability to do both, line up at D end or edge. Same with Mace Funa. Mace was playing a decent amount of D end on whatever team he was. I think he was green team during the spring game. And then the only addition that I've had in this group was Mateo Uiagalelei. Heading into the spring, I had no idea what to think of him. Other than that, he's highly rated kid. Watched all of his tape. I know what he looks like, what he plays like, what he should look like, and that was exactly what he did look like during the spring and especially the spring game. So I was impressed with him overall. I thought he got after the quarterback a lot during the spring game. I thought he did really well against, again, it was backup guys, but still Feope Laulu and Michael Wooten. I thought he did really well against them. Was quick to the ball, quick after the snap. I think that he should be a guy who's going to be in a package for a passing down situation for sure. I think you try to line up Dorlus, Birch on the inside, and then let Mateo rush out on the edge, and with Popo as well as an interior defensive end. interior defensive linemen. So that would be ideal. But overall, I think this group was pretty solidified from Brandon Dorlus announcing his return, and then Jordan Birch committing. There's a lot of talent on this defensive front. It would surprise me if a freshman made a really significant impact that got them into the starting lineup just because of how good the guys are in front of them. But this is my group. What do you guys think?
I guess my first question was, I noticed there's only one or on the depth chart. And by the way, go check these out on Duck Territory. I, similar to Jared, tried to not use as many. We know what the depth chart will eventually look like, where there'll be like 13 of them, and I think we both tried to avoid them. Why was Popo and Taki a position? I agree with you, because I think that's a competition I'm really curious to track come fall. But why was that the only one where you thought maybe there's an or should be used?
Yeah, that was a pretty easy decision for me, just because it's going to depend on who Oregon plays. If it's more of a pass heavy attack, you want Popo in there. If it's more of a rush heavy attack, you want Taki in there. We didn't get to watch Popo last year due to injury, but the year before he was one of Oregon's best pass rushers. This past season, Taki was one of Oregon's best rush defenders. And so you just kind of, I think Oregon and Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy, Tony Tuioti, I think they're all very comfortable with whoever's going to start at that position. But I think it's all variable on matchup dependence. I think Popo's really going to be able to rush the passer this season. We've heard a lot of really glowing things about him from Tony Tuioti, from Dan Lanning, from Tosh Lupoy, that he's back to where he was originally pre-injury. So we'd love to hear that. But I think Taki's an excellent rush defender. Not a lot of ors. I don't like Eric, like you said, it's going to be a lot of ors once the real depth chart comes around, and I don't want it to be that. So I want it to be solidified. Like, hey, I think this guy's going to start and this guy's going to be the backup. But these guys, I can see them both starting. I don't know how many games are going to be on the schedule, 12, 13. I can see them 6 and 7. I think it'll all be kind of matchup dependent with those guys.
It's notable that there's only one freshman too in this group. A lot of experience, so it's going to be really hard for the freshmen, whether they're true freshmen or redshirt freshmen, to kind of crack this group. But I think this just goes in line with like, hey, like you've got to be pretty special just to even crack the two deep of this group. Was there anybody that you like? I guess my question is like, who was maybe the toughest guy for you to leave off the list? Because the names that aren't on the list: Jake Shipley, Amarion Winston, Ben Roberts, Tatum Tuioti, Makil Gardner, Pome, Johnny Bowens, Jaden Moore. Was there anyone that was like, I have to give a thought here, or was it pretty clear cut? Like there was no one beyond Mateo that deserved to be on here.
The only name was Amarion Winston. In the lone opportunities that we've seen 11-on-11 football during the spring, he was oftentimes with the 1 or 2. I went with Mateo because I think he has a higher upside. Again, this is going to be one of my more biased picks because of his upside, because of what I saw in the spring game, because of his recruiting profile, because of his natural athleticism. That's a biased pick on me. I'm putting him on the second team. I do think that Amarion Winston did well during the spring game. I've been pleasantly surprised with his growth. I didn't really anticipate him being a contributing member into this year's defense, but I certainly anticipate that he will be this upcoming season. However, Oregon doesn't have any edge rushers. They have like 4 or 5 guys on roster. And Jake Shipley was hurt for most of spring camp. I'm not even sure that he's necessarily an edge rusher. But again, he was a guy whose name was brought up as Dan, talked about potential tight end options, which is all a bunch of baloney, but I digress. I don't really see Shipley, impacting the team that much. I'd say he probably has a similar role as what he had last year, which is limited, as a nice way to put it. But Amarion, I think, is going to be an impact guy, mostly because they have to have him be an impact guy because they don't got a lot of depth there, and that he's actually improved. I think he looks better physically. I think he looks better at the point of attack. I think his first step is pretty good. I was pleasantly surprised again with what I saw during the spring game. So that was the only guy where I was like, I should probably give some love to him. But again, this is my depth chart. So I was a little bit biased, and I put Mateo Uiagalelei in front of him.
I think I share your bias. I think that's probably the right.
I think it's fair.
You know,
it's definitely a bias, but I think it's
I
fair.
agree with it.
I mean,
I have no problem with it.
you think about where these two. I mean, if you want to focus it on Amarion versus Mateo or Tatum or whoever you want to throw in there, Mateo is a borderline 5-star recruit. Some services had him as a 5-star. He's one of the more, I guess, prized guys, more anticipated players in this class, and he came in and had an awesome spring game. And we saw very little of this spring to really give us a feel for this edge stuff. And as you said, Jared, there aren't many options. So I was kind of trying to go through this too while I was looking at your depth chart before we started, going like, okay, who would I even substitute there? And kind of like you, I came to the conclusion of I could go with one of these redshirt freshmen or another one of these true freshmen, but I don't think that they really have much of a shot to. I mean, I don't think that they're like clearly ahead. So yeah, I think that's the right spot, and I think Mateo will be on defense certainly the only true freshman that we have in our two deeps. And for me next week, to give a little hint, you might not see any other true freshmen on there either, just because I think based upon what we saw this spring, certainly some guys who are really impressive, but a lot of veterans back that make it difficult to really peg one of those guys in the top two units.
And I would add one more thing, just Mateo's pass rushing grade, or not his grade, but I guess his ability. Even if that's his only thing, it's still better than the best that Amarion has. And that's no disrespect to Amarion. I just think Mateo's pass rushing ability is really good. I think it's like circa Kayvon Thibodeau when he was a true freshman. Doesn't have the same explosiveness or get off the line, but he's a stronger, more polished of a defensive lineman in terms of your pass rush moves. And that's all Kayvon Thibodeau was asked to do for the first bunch of games till Gus Cumberlander got hurt. Just, hey, third down, go rush the passer. And that's what I think Mateo will be doing this year.
Winston is just like I mean, this is no shot at him, but I agree with the decision. Mateo was a 5-star guy, 5-star athlete, and Winston was a borderline 4-star recruit. They're just two different players. Winston is a guy that you would hope this season, after a year of redshirting, has developed a little bit, can get on the field in some capacity, and then as a sophomore, maybe next year, that's his opportunity to really make a push for a starting lineup spot or a 2-deep spot. Whereas Mateo's athletically, he's there. He just now needs to fine-tool the techniques and the skills to get there. All right. We went through defensive line. Let's go to linebacker, and then we'll take a break after this one. Small group, 2 positions, the Mac and the money. Your thoughts going into this one?
I had a lot of thoughts going into this one, mostly because of what we haven't seen in 11 on 11. What does Justin Jacobs look like? What does Jamal Hill look like? Connor Sewell? Is there any depth behind Jeffrey Bossa, more or less, because he's the only returning linebacker? And again, I was very pleasantly surprised during the spring game. I thought a lot of guys had some good days at the office. So for this, a Mac and money linebacker, for those that don't know, a Mac linebacker is your kind of prototypical middle linebacker, guy who's going to be calling the plays, guys who's probably going to be stuffing the run. Kind of one of your main interior linebackers, while the money is more of your how do I describe this? More of your pass protection linebacker, a guy who's going to drop back into coverage, a guy who's going to be a little bit more versatile, have a different but similar skill set as your Mac linebacker. So I got Justin Jacobs as a starting Mac linebacker. I have Jeffrey Boss as a starting money, and then Jamal Hill as the backup Mac, and then Devin Jackson as your backup money. And full disclosure, my Devin Jackson pick was complete bias because I think Connor Sewell had a good game, but there's also not a whole lot of options here, similar to edge rusher. Oregon saw 2 linebackers hit the transfer portal, Harrison Taggart and Keith Brown, like I mentioned earlier. So they're limited. But as the founding father of the Devin Jackson fan club last season, to see him perform like he did at the spring game and to hear what coaches and players have said about him during press conferences and interviews, I think he's really improved. And I think his speed is something that Oregon definitely needs along the perimeter, and especially at their linebacking group. But, Justin Jacobs was a guy who, big-time transfer recruit, former 4-star out of Ohio, transfer from Iowa, had a season-ending injury last season, so I wasn't necessarily sure that he was going to be ready by the time spring ball came around. He played in the spring game, looked good. Definitely the bigger of the 2 linebackers between he and Bossa, even though Bossa gained some weight. So I thought that was a pretty easy pick for my Mac. That's what I had going into spring. I think that's what I had like our first depth chart prediction, because I think he's just a really, really good player. Go watch his Iowa tape. This guy's when he's healthy, he can be a really big impact guy in the game. And then Bossa looked good. I think we know what we kind of expect from him. Jamal Hill, I think, was the surprise of the spring game. I thought he looked really good as a linebacker, made some plays into open space against Noah Whittington. I think it was Noah Whittington, either that or Bucky Irving. Either way, it was an impressive performance. I think he led the yellow team in tackles, or the green team in tackles. He did with 4. Yeah, it was Hill. Devin Jackson did lead the yellow team in tackles with 5, him and Bossa. But I digress. But I think Hill was – it was really good. I think it made a lot of sense when we heard that Hill was moving to linebacker. He's always been a bigger nickel safety. He's always played better in the box than as a free or a field safety. So I think that it was a natural transition. I think he's going to do really well at it. However, he's not starting.
To the Devin Jackson part, just again, I don't have any disagreement at all. I think you could perceive it as bias, but I think it's just the right pick. Jared, I think Devin Jackson is like looked like one of the 3 best linebackers in the field for a lot of the spring game, and was another one of those guys. He's got the profile as a recruit. Obviously, we know the athletic intangibles that probably led you to start the Devin Jackson fan club, Jared, just in terms of the speed and athleticism and how he carries. Some of the weight he's gained seemingly doesn't really slow him down much, which I think is really encouraging for a young linebacker. Like I could see him adding 5 to 10 more pounds and still staying really freaking fast, which is a really good thing to have on a football field, especially in this sort of a defense. So like, yeah, I fully anticipate Devin Jackson's going to play quite a bit this season. I think it would be a big step to put him over Jeffrey Bossa, given that Bossa started the last 2 seasons. So no arguments, but I'm just saying, I don't think it would be, once again, you'd have to be kind of twisting your own arm to not pick Jackson, I think, in terms of putting, whether it be Sewell, who, I don't know, in my head, I have more of as a Mac guy. I don't know if you have really a strong stance or where he was working, but just physically, it seems like he maybe would fit there more. But yeah, I don't have any issues there. And then I guess I don't really have any issues with the Justin Jacobs over Jamal Hill thing, just because if you look at what they were trying to do last year in terms of having a bigger linebacker like a Noah Sewell, like I see Jacobs as, and this is going to sound like disrespect to Noah Sewell, but just based upon where he was at physically, like Justin Jacobs is a similar bodied, more explosive, better athlete than what we saw from Noah Sewell. So having somebody out there makes a ton of sense, especially next to Bossa, who's always going to be, even if he adds more weight, a little bit undersized just based upon his height and length and all of that. So I think that pairing makes a ton of sense. I'm also excited to see a hypothetical where you do see Jamal and Jeff out there together, which I'm sure we might see it a little bit, maybe a lot if it becomes a package that works. But I think you see certain games where you could see a lot of some combination like that, where you get against a team that is going to try to dice you up over the middle, or a team that's a little bit maybe more like when you play Washington, you might see a lot of Jamal and Jeff together, and that'll be kind of a fun thing to see. I know there's not a lot of bodies here, which gets concerning because you know the history at this position, even the last couple of years with injury. But if everybody is staying healthy, and I'm knocking on wood as I say that, like I think you have the players without question to be pretty darn good at this second level. And it sounds weird to say considering the caliber of recruit that you had on last year's roster, but I think it's pretty likely we come away from the 23 season saying linebacker play improved from 2022. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with finding players that fit this scheme a little bit better, and honestly, just that are a little bit more athletic. And that was clearly a thing they looked at this offseason when they were trying to figure out who fit this group.
I have really no major complaints for this one. I would have done Sewell over Jackson, but I'm not like, hey, it needs to happen. I understand Jackson looked tremendous in the spring game, and just like Mateo and Winston, Jackson's like a freak athlete, and it's just been, can you get Jackson developed? Can you get him into the into the scheme? He understands what he's doing, and once he does, the athleticism takes over, and that's where he becomes a really special player. So like I have no issues with Jackson being on there. I probably would have put Connor on there ahead, but this is a case where they're probably going to duke it out for the first 3 or 4 games of the season, and then one will emerge. And typically, when you see a guy, when you see this kind of a matchup, you tend to go with what Jared did, the more athletic, the more physically better built player, and that's Devin Jackson. Maybe it doesn't click from like an understanding the scheme standpoint, but everything else is there. So I get it. The Jamal Hill one for me is going to be interesting because I think he looked really good. Jared laid it out perfectly. Maybe a better spot for him now that he's heavier. But is he going to be big enough to push Bossa or Jacobs out of the first group? I don't know. That's going to be the wild card, where he may be tremendous but just can't get higher because of the two guys ahead of him.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
Like Erik said, they need more athleticism. I know Sewell was hurt for most of the season last year, but Bossa was their most athletic guy, but certainly still an undersized linebacker in that position. And teams took advantage of that. And now that Bossa has more weight and hasn't really lost a step off, athletically, and neither has Jamal Hill, that gives him more positional versatility. Even with all the, like Erik said, all the highly recruited linebackers that they had, it just didn't fit the scheme that they have now laid into this program. And this position group this year seems to have those guys, at least on paper. Unfortunately, games are never played on paper, so we'll have to see what it looks like in real life. But if the spring game was any microcosm of what it could be, it was a good sign, where linebackers led both teams in tackles for, I think, what was it, Erik? Like 2 times last year that happened?
2 times.
Two or 3 times. So that's a good sign, and that's what you need. I think for the one more thing on Jackson, the main reason I have him as on the 2 deep is because of one play in particular. There was an end around to Noah Whittington on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And Devin Jackson shot the gap and tackled Whittington for a gain of 1, maybe 2 yards. No one was doing that last year, mostly because they either A, weren't in position, which happened a lot, or B, they just weren't athletic enough. They just weren't fast enough to get around the edge, to shoot between the tackle and the guard without either one of them, putting a hand on or blocking them. That's what Devin Jackson did. If you can find that, in the film, just rewatch it over and over again and try to imagine somebody from last year's team doing it, because it wasn't happening. And that one play, I was like, shoot, man, this is different. This is a different type of linebacker than Oregon has had in the past. And I'm excited to see just if he gets some reps. So that one play is why I have him on my 2 deep. That, and as wearing the crown of the Devin Jackson fan club.
I just have one more question before we get off linebacker. What about Jamal Hill over at money in place of Bossa? I'm not pitching it. I'm just thinking aloud of different combinations that could work. Do we just see Hill and Bossa as such a similar players? Obviously, they play different positions, but it seems like their strengths are in the same kind of groups of attributes. Do you think that works any better, possibly? What would your thought of if Jamal developed himself into a starting caliber player next to Justin, as opposed to someone competing for snaps there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be for it. I just think that Bossa's skill set is still better at the money than Jamal Hill's is. Bossa also has 2 years of linebacking experience.
Sure.
I think that helps more in the coverage side of things rather than being the MAC, where you're more of a run blocker. Obviously, you have to jump into coverage, of course, but your main priority is calling the defense and jumping into run defense and trying to stop anything from coming forward at you. And I do think that Hill is, at least in stature, seems to be the more physically prepared guy to be a linebacker than Bossa, even though Bossa did add weight and looks like a better linebacker now. Hill's just a big boy.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like Jacobs, Hill has the ability to jump out into coverage and jump out and cover tight ends, larger receivers. Both were really good in pass coverage in the earlier years. I think that this is going to be a better spot for Hill, like I said earlier. But I mean, I'd be for it. I just think that, at this point, I see Bossa as the guy next to Jacobs and not Hill.
Totally fair. Just throwing it out there. Just something I was thinking about looking at the names and bodies.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dive into the corners and the safety position groups. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Cornerback room now. This is one where we probably kind of know who the four are. It's just where they fit, maybe, and more so the order of the two groups. Jared, your thoughts on just how you came about coming up with the 2 deep here at cornerback?
Yeah, so for my field cornerbacks, I have Bridges and Manning, and my boundary cornerbacks, I have Kyrie Jackson and Jaleel Florence. Not a whole lot went into this, I'll be honest. I think this is exactly the same group of four that I had in my spring depth chart, and for reasons why it should be. If you watch the spring game, it was clear that Kyrie Jackson is going to be an impact player at Oregon. If you watch last season, Trequez Bridges was a solid quarterback next to Christian Gonzalez on the other side of the field. And then you saw moments of Jaleel Florence where he came in and did his thing in the games and, provided a spark off the bench. Dante Manning did something similar, maybe not as much. He had a decent Holiday Bowl game. His best game actually was against Arizona. And then he got knocked out for targeting, which unfortunate because he was playing a great game. I think that those are clearly the four best cornerbacks on the roster right now, today. Because there's still a couple guys who are coming in. Dalen Austin, Roderick Pleasant, both basically top 100 recruits in high school, both running track, both really fast. Guys who I think physically could perform at the D1 level, but they'll have to learn the playbook, so that's something else. But I think it was pretty simple. I think that Cole Martin had a great spring game. I just don't think that to be honest, I don't think he's tall enough to be a real cornerback, like a cover or like a boundary cornerback or a field cornerback, because he's 5'10", 5'11". I don't know what he's listed at, but it's not great. But him as a nickel corner was fantastic because he's burly enough, he's thick enough to get into a defender and be a safety type player in that essence. But you look at Kyrie Jackson, who I think is 6'2" or 6'3". Interviewing him, we were looking eye to eye, and I'm like, that's 6'2" level, but he's a tall kid. Trequez Bridges has a wingspan over 7 feet. So does Dante Manning. Like, these guys are long and they're athletic. They're exactly who you want to see as a cornerback. And that's why I have these four guys. They're all very athletic. I think I could still jump on the Dante Manning hype train because I still just love what he does, what he is like physically and athletically. He just hasn't gotten down the cadence of being a cornerback like Trequez Bridges has, moving from safety over to corner. I still think it's a good cornerback room. I was impressed with what Kyrie Jackson did during the spring game. I think he's a clear boundary guy rather than I think you give the lesser assignment to Bridges, you give the better assignment to Kyrie. Not to say that Bridges is bad, but I still think that Bridges is a good cornerback. I think that these are just the clear four guys. It wasn't really much of a debate in my head.
Cole, I'm in total agreement. That was kind of where that was the first thing I thought of, was if there was anyone from the spring game who really stood out, whose name wasn't mentioned, it would be his. And to your point, it was the exact one I was just going to make, which is when you get into certain matchups, he's going to be probably a little bit more valuable than other games. Because to your point, I don't know if he can really thrive on the outside because we don't have heights and weights, but I mean, he looks like he's maybe 5'9", 5'10". I don't know. That's not going to hold up in a lot of situations, but if you put him in the slot, and when you get into situations where that's going to be a matchup where, again, like we talked about earlier, against a Washington where you're going to throw a lot, and Washington, especially last year, go back and watch it. Obviously, they utilize their outside receivers a lot, but they do throw over the middle of the field quite a bit and into their slot receivers. So a guy like Cole Martin might have a busy day there, but I think for the most part, you're going to be seeing him as kind of a situational guy. And it might be a game like that where he plays a lot. And there might be a game where he doesn't see the field hardly at all just because of the situation. But total agreement with your four guys. Don't have a whole lot to add there. The Kyrie Trequez kind of jockeying feels like right now for kind of the alpha of the group. That's at least the way I sort of felt kind of coming out of spring. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. And I think the other part that just stood out to me from our one conversation with Coach Martin was just that he didn't want to name who the alpha could be if there was a guy on the roster, because he wanted to wait and see how the young guys coming in were. I don't know if that was a sense that he really thinks that between Austin and Pleasant, one of those guys could develop into a starting caliber player, or if he was just trying to, not put the cart before the horse and say too much about what he's seen in camp. Just thought it was a kind of an interesting comment. And I think you certainly are going to be very curious about what we see from a development perspective from either of those true freshmen. It wasn't, you see it fairly regularly where at least a true freshman can be at least a contributor. Jaleel Florence last year, you think about it over the years, whether it was Mikael Wright or Thomas Graham, guys who played or started games as true freshmen. I wouldn't be surprised to see one of those two guys kind of throw their name into this conversation. And where Jared has it as a clear-cut 4, maybe it becomes 5 or 6 guys that are really, really up in that competition. But right now, I don't think there's any question. These are the right 4 guys, and I don't really have much of an issue with the order either.
Yeah, I all I have to say on this one, because the order's right, I think the players are right, is just the acknowledgement that Cole Martin's a lot shorter, like Jared said, than everybody else, which goes away with how Oregon's been recruiting. You look at the guys they're targeting in this year's class, the guys that they have on their roster. There are not a lot of the sub 6 footers on the roster right now or being recruited. Cole Martin's one of the only ones that fits that bill. They like really tall, really long, athletic dudes to play that spot. And so maybe, like Jared pointed out, hadn't really dawned on me until he said it, but maybe Cole's going to be kind of just locked into one specific position, and that's what his career is going to be like, playing in the slot for Oregon as a quarterback. Maybe he grows, but he was really good in the spring game, no doubt. And so, you don't want to just say, oh, well, he's not 6 foot or taller, so he's going to be terrible. But, it's just interesting. It's an interesting anecdote that he doesn't fit the type of body type that we typically see Oregon going after. And how does that impact things?
I think it'll be fine with Martin. Yeah. And, all this to say that he's still a good player. He still had a very good
I'm not trying to
game.
say he wasn't.
No, 100%. I understand. But for the viewers or the listeners out there, he was really good in the spring game. I thought he was probably one of the best corners on the field. I really liked what I saw from Kyrie Jackson. But like to Eric's point, there will be moments where Oregon is going to implement a 4-2-5 defense where it has a nickel corner rather than a nickel safety. And something like what they did against Arizona and what they tried to do at times against Washington. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Cole Martin just starts those games, just gets career starts blank and blank. Or if Oregon, how they feel about their safety situation, which we'll get to in a minute, if they just don't throw that combination out there every game. Because Cole Martin looked the part as a star, as a nickel star or a corner star, whatever you want to call it, because more or less that is a positionless, place to play in the field. Like a star safety is the same as a star corner. It's all the same. And if they want to put that lineup out with Cole Martin as that starting star, they could do that the entire season if they so wanted to, depending on how they feel about their safety situation. If they want to just play Evan Williams and Tyshim Johnson and have Cole Martin as the other safety, quote unquote, they can do that real easily, because I think Cole Martin, honestly, is pretty perfect for that because he's built like a safety. He's very similar in stature and size to Tyshim Johnson, who was a star safety at Ole Miss, but they all do their positional versatility. So I think that the options now are better than they were last season, where you saw Christian Gonzalez have to play nickel because somebody else wasn't prepared to play that against Arizona. Now you have options. Now you have 4 cornerbacks. You have another year of development from Jaleel Florence, and you guys got really talented guys coming on campus in the summer. I think they got options here, which is a good thing.
Not making a comparison, but just bringing up the fact, and you kind of already said it with Tyshim, but you look around the NFL and even in college, there are oftentimes smaller-bodied players that are really successful playing kind of a nickel hybrid role, whether it be like a Budda Baker or a Tyrone Matthew. Obviously, in the NFL, I'm not saying he's those guys at all, because that would be really ridiculous to make that comparison after one scrimmage. But I'm just saying, you could see him develop into something more than just, he's recruited and it's written as a 5'10" corner on his profile. That's what it's going to say. I just think there's potentially more versatility, and to the point Jared made, I think he could play a couple of different spots ultimately. Maybe we'll see them. They might be a little bit slower in terms of cross-training him because he is a true freshman. They typically do that. He's also the son of the position coach, so they might be feeling like he's pretty advanced, and that's something he could take on earlier than some other guys. But to Jared's point, I'm really high on Cole. That was somebody who I didn't have maybe massive expectations for coming into spring, but I came out of the spring game going, there's something here, and at some point it's going to pop in a game. And I don't know if that's this fall. I don't know if that's next year or if it's the year after, but there's something there, and I think it could be kind of something interesting depending upon how they approach where he works and fits positionally.
Yeah, I had Erik when you were gone, I made the comment, so I should have said this at the very beginning. I have Cole being one of the freshmen in the 2 deep, at the start of the season. So I'm not down on Cole. It's just an acknowledgement of size difference between everybody else. All right. Safety group, Jared. Last one for the show. 3 different positions: free safety, boundary safety, and also the star spot. Another one, was it difficult? Was it easy? How would you describe this position group?
I would say it was pretty difficult, just not seeing anything over the entire spring, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. And then obviously the 2 teams split in the spring game. There's 2 names that are like going to start. I would write it down in pen and put money on it. And Evan Williams and Tysheem Johnson. I have Tysheem starting at the star safety with Kamari Terrell as the backup. I still like his upside a lot. Boundary safety, I have Steve Stevens and JJ Greenfield. And then free safety or field safety, whatever you want to call it, I have Evan Williams and Brian Addison as the 1 and the 2 deep there. Yeah, Williams and Tysheem Johnson are going to start. They both played very well at the spring game. I think everything else is up for grab, meaning that boundary safety position where I have Steve starting with JJ Greenfield as a backup. I don't know. This could go a whole lot of ways. I know that there were a couple of comments on the article about how they wanted Brian Addison to play there. I think Brian Addison is only a free safety or a field safety. I think that he is your center field. And I'm sure that he could play boundary safety because, again, the positional versatility, the cross-training, all that mumbo-jumbo. I'm sure he could do it, but I think his skill set best serves him to be a field safety or a free safety because it's a center field. It's 6'5" dude who's fast and athletic and long and can jump up and contest long, deep passes and hopefully get back there in time to do so. For Steve, I gave Steve the benefit of the doubt. This is his 5th or 6th year in the program. He's been here, 6, yeah. Been here a long time, understands what it means to be a boundary safety, started multiple games there last year. He's probably not the best boundary safety in the world, but I think I had to give him the start there. I liked what I saw from JJ Greenfield. Again, Kamari Terrell's another guy. This position group is really top heavy, I feel. Again, we didn't see Damon David at all during the spring. He was hurt for like all but 1 or 2 practices at the very beginning. And then you have freshmen who came in, Tyler Turner, Cody DeCambra. I don't really know what to make of them, although safety is probably the easiest position to learn on a football field, more or less. I don't know. It's a tough one. I might just throw Bryce Betcher in there, another biased pick. But I think, the boundary safety, if somebody comes through, I think that's the clear position that is the weakest. But this kind of goes back to my Cole Martin point where maybe Oregon punts on that idea. They want to bring in BA and Steve Stevens off the bench. They move Tysheem Johnson to boundary. They move Evan Williams to boundary or to free, and then Tysheem Johnson to boundary or free. Keep that star safety position, star corner position with Cole Martin, and then go from there. I don't know what they'll do, but boundary safety is the question mark that I had.
Jared, if there was ever a time for you to push the Bryce Betcher narrative, it's now.
Do it now.
Oh, yeah.
This is.
He looked good the spring game.
Everybody listen, go read my feature story on Bryce Betcher. It's pinned to my Twitter profile, so there you go.
It's a good read. And he's a good player. No, he's not on your 2 deep, and I obviously agree with why, but guy had a nice spring game. He's been a good player on special teams. Like, it's kind of cool seeing a local kid. I just want to give him a little shout out, and I'm happy Jared has covered him so well. But I think I don't really have much of an issue. I guess if we wanted to get their best coverage team on the field, you would put Addison at free safety, and maybe you could slide Evan Williams over to boundary. I'm just trying to think about how some of these combinations would work, but I'm in agreement. And we kind of talked about this. We talked about this before, I know, with Steve, where it's like physically, I think everybody's understanding he's not the athlete a lot of these guys are, but mentally, and you have to remember this is a huge part of it on the field. Like, he's like one of the top IQ guys on the field. He's really, really good in terms of getting everything set up. So I do think there is a lot of value there, unless an Evan or somebody else is, comparable or really close to comparable. I think you need someone like that out there.
That was the guy Hampton named first when was asked about like the leadership and the communication. Like it was Steve Stevens.
So I think he has more value than I think the average fan would think. And I know we've been critical too, because some of the stuff physically last year wasn't awesome, but I don't think you can. I think it would be hard to say he's not going to play big snaps unless there's somebody else who's, again, unless Evan Williams or Ty Sheem is just like they are right there with him and they have a full read of the defense they have, and they can kind of substitute for him. I don't know if that works, but I do like the idea of if you could get, BA out there. I'm in total agreement. Jared laid it out really well of just the length and speed. And if he's covering a lot of space out there, that makes a ton of sense. Certainly it's going to be hard to beat him over the top unless he makes the wrong read if he's playing out there. So I like that. And it would be, I think, could be advantageous to have Ty Sheem maybe at boundary there, and you could put Cole at nickel in terms of if you were trying to get your best coverage group out there or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how all of that works, but yeah, there's a lot of things to work with. But to Jared's point as well, it is kind of a top-heavy group, and I think some of the guys we expected to be up here, like a Damon David's a guy who, when he was recruited and brought in, I thought he was eventually going to be a guy who was in the 2 deep. 3 years in, I would have told you, gosh, he seems like he would be. He had a really strong spring his freshman year, and has kind of just, we haven't heard much from him. And to your point, I don't know what you can expect from these true freshmen either. So the guys you listed are kind of the guys, and I don't have a ton of confidence or haven't seen enough from either JJ or Kamari to be like, that guy is surefire to be a positive presence on the field. So there are some questions from a depth perspective, for sure. And I think that's something that we'll be kind of following throughout the year. But there are a core group of guys that I think are very capable players, even if kind of the mix and match of it is sort of maybe difficult to kind of envision at times.
I look at this and I think you've got 2 really good guys, Evan Williams and Tysheem Johnson. I think they've got to be on the field basically at all times. And then it's just going to be like what Jared said, situational rotation, whether it's Addison getting on the field for passing downs, or Steve Stevens, or JJ Greenfield maybe getting on there as well. But I think you've got 2 really experienced, you've got 2 proven commodities in Evan Williams and Tysheem Johnson. Granted, aren't proven at Oregon, but at previous spots. Addison's proven in certain areas. I think Steve's value as an IQ guy and communicator on the field is highly valuable. His coach even says it. But there's just limitations with both Addison and Stevens. And it's just going to be a little bit of mixing and matching to the opponent that you're playing that particular week, and also the down and the distance type of situation that they're dealing with on a play-by-play move. Guys not on the depth chart, I don't really have any issues at all here. There really aren't any obvious ones. And we'll see if that changes. I mean, Ty Turner and Cody DeCambra were both here for spring ball. Like, can they make, what kind of jumps will they make? Solomon, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe, I guess the question here becomes, like, Jared's talked a lot about cross-training on this podcast. He mentioned it a lot in the show, or in the story. We know that they've done it. Do they try, do they solve some of these safety issues by maybe moving a Triquez Bridges over to safety and, leaning into the depth they have at corner to help at safety? I don't know.
Yes, the Triquez Bridges needs to move back to safety argument. I think that all entirely depends on how they feel about their cornerback depth, because while we know that there's a lot of talent in the room, and again, they're going to get some in the summer with Dalen Austin and Roderick Pleasant, that's cool on paper. But like I said earlier, play the games on them. You got to go on the field and play. And maybe they feel great about their cornerback depth. Maybe Jaleel Florence has made such a huge jump that he is very comparable, or Dante Manning is very comparable to what Triquez Bridges can be in the field, and then they can move him back to where I think he would play best as a free safety or boundary safety. Maybe. Hasn't happened. Hasn't happened in 2 years. Hasn't happened basically in 3 years. So I'm a little skeptical of that. I do think that it could be a possibility, but again, I think it just depends on how they feel about their cornerback depth. Because you look at a guy like Manning, who 5-star recruit, in that 2020 class, you would kind of expect him or hope for him to be a starting grade cornerback at this point in his career. And if Triquez Bridges, a 3-star Alabama guy from, I think, Lancaster in Alabama, if he's your starting cornerback for 2 straight years now, there's some development thing that happened with Bridges and maybe not with Manning. But maybe that changes this offseason. Maybe that changes in the fall. Maybe they think that this is their best option. And if that's the case, then I kind of really like their secondary. With Manning's versatility and athleticism, and then Bridges at safety, I think is his best and natural position. I think it's impressive that he's able to perform at both pretty darn well, but safety just makes a lot more sense in my opinion because of his length and his speed and his skill set. But we'll see. I'm still waiting on that because Brian Addison and Triquez Bridges are the best safety combo on the team.
I guess one thing, just wrapping up defensive back talk, is sort of to Matt's point of guys that cross-trained that were previously perceived oftentimes as corners playing nickel or playing safety. We saw that with, I think, most of these guys, with the exception of Kyrie, I think was with the only guy who was like, I haven't really been doing a lot of that. Just be really curious to see if anything comes from that. Like, do we see Jaleel Florence playing nickel more than we expected? We talked about it already. Does Triquez end up in the back at all? Personally, I'm kind of with Jared where I'd love to see it, but probably not expecting to see it. And if we do see it, also to Jared's point, it's a good one. It means someone else has stepped up at corner, and that's not a bad thing at all. So, but yeah, no, they spend a lot of time, especially with this group, kind of mixing and matching and playing guys all over the place. I'll be curious to see if there are any maybe surprise decisions that come from those exercises. Do they come away thinking a guy that we all perceive to be a corner is actually better suited here or there? Something to at least watch for when we get into fall.
All right, it's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. Make sure to go read full detail of Jared's 2 deep predictions on duckterritory.com. We'll have more coverage, continued coverage, I guess, of Oregon football on duckterritory.com throughout the summer. Next on the pod, we will be breaking down later next week the offensive side of the football, which Erik took on that exercise. So look for that coming here in the next couple of days. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.